welcome back to Africa and Everywhere Conversations with 𝐒𝐭𝐤. It's your host, 𝐒𝐭𝐤𝐬𝐚𝐵, and this is the last episode of season 1. I know the season has come to an end, but I also just wanted to disclaim and say Happy New Year to all of the listeners of the podcast. Thank you for joining us in 2024. I hope you've enjoyed just being a part of the community and listening to the episodes that we have to bring out to you. I really enjoyed it. So yes, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and it was recorded before the year ended, so please just keep that in mind whilst listening. Bye and enjoy the episode. Today we have 2 special guests. We'll be talking on the topic of climate change, the energy transition, all things climate related, and the impact it has on Africans, young Africans, African businesses, African entrepreneurs, African women and children, and why it matters, like why people should feel that, okay, climate change actually impacts me somehow. It's not just a thing that flies over your head and is not relatable, but it is relatable. And so we have 2 special guests here today to help bring the message home. We have Daniel Aryee, the Policy Advocacy Co-ordinator at the African Union Commission, the Office of the Special Envoy on Youth, as well as a Chief Catalyst of Colour Your Space. And we also have Lyzianah Emakoua, the founder of the Center for Community Impact and Sustainability and convening of the 2024 Local Conference of Youth, Sierra Leone. So thank you both so much for being here. I'm really excited to get into this conversation. So before we get into the bulk of the conversation, I like to start with this segment I have. So it's a rapid fire segment, and I basically just ask you a question to help like the listeners get to know you better and me too. So my first question is, do you have a quote you live your life by or think of often? Lyzianah, do you want to go first?
I'll go first. Mine is the Bible scripture in Matthew 5:16. It talks about letting your light shine before others. That they may see your good deeds and glorify the Father in heaven. And why? Because for me the verse reminds me that true impact comes from serving others. In a way that reflects God's love. And then I'm someone that I love community work and serving others and giving back to the community. So for me, it's a way to give God glory.
Okay. No, that's really nice. Yeah, I know that reminds me of how the Bible also talks about like we should be the salt and light of the earth. So that's really nice. Thank you. And then Daniel, over to you.
Yes, scripture is, I get a lot of quotes from scripture. But this time around, I would reflect a quote that actually became the basis of my theme for 2023. I have like yearly themes, so stay tuned for the theme for 2025. So for 2023, my theme was embedded in this quote, which says that you cannot swim for new horizons if you do not have the courage to lose sight of the shore. And basically that theme resonates with the call for many of us to go deeper and to leave our comfort zones and to move into terrains that may seem uncomfortable but would yield good fruits at the end. So yeah, that's really a theme that I really, really love so much. Thank you.
That's a good one. Thank you. I thought maybe you two were going to use like a scripture verse, but no, that's really good. And then briefly, I guess I can say mine. I normally like to remind myself, of this saying, like, this too shall pass, because it's just kind of a form of encouragement. It's okay, like whatever it is you might be going through now, like this too will come to pass, and like it's been and so will be able to be. Yes. But okay, so for our first question on the topic, I think it'd be helpful to kind of explain, like, right, when we talk about climate change, energy transition, all of this stuff, like what does it actually mean? Like breaking it down to people that might not understand. So I'm not sure who would like to go first, but could you please let us know what is climate change and maybe link it to Africa perhaps?
Okay, let me start. So I want to categorize climate change within three scopes. So the biological scope, the socio-economic scope, and also the cultural and spiritual scope. So I'll start off with the biological scope. One, as human beings, when you are born into the earth. you are born into an ecosystem, and when you are born into the earth, now you start the journey of survival, basically, because as soon as you are born, the likelihood of you passing away is very, very easy. There are so many factors that could take away your life. So now you are battling many barriers and many challenges to live as long as you can on this earth. Now imagine naturally battling all of these challenges and giving more leeway to some of these challenges to have more reason to take you out of the earth. Now, I know I'm speaking in parables, but let me bring clarity to what I'm saying. Now, you live in a cultural community and you want to urbanize that community. And then you start off by cutting trees in that community, disrupting the biodiversity in that community. What do you expect to happen at the end of the day? It's going to fight back, right? So now, within this context of the biological element of climate change, we live and die in climate. I think that is something that we need to hear, or we need to have sound clarity on, that we live and die in the climate conditions we find ourselves in. So it means that climate change is as close to us as we can ever imagine. It's not a far away myth or something that you need to go to a university to study. It's literally just right beside us. So now that is the biological element of climate. Now the socio-economic element of climate. Now we also depend on the environment, to enhance our source of livelihood. We depend on the environment for food, plant food, animal food, and all the other various sources of food. Now I just want to limit it to food because I know we might not have so much time. Now looking at the great demand that the current population has, now we are a population of, I believe, of 8 billion people, which means that the food needs going to be varying. There are people who can live with 1 square meal a day. There are some people who can live with 4 square meals a day. So if you balance it out, you notice that there's so much pressure on the earth for food supply. And to be able to balance it out now, some factions that, I'll just be very blunt, some factions that do not really understand the implications of destroying the environment try to alter the natural order of things, where they try to manipulate natural processes in food production. There are some good methodologies like climate smart agriculture and some very solid methodologies, but there are also equally very damaging methodologies. So now this also brings perspective that climate change is also socio-economic factor. The social and economic element of the world we find ourselves in also has a very strong dependability or dependence on the current climate structure. Finally, culturally and spiritually as well, in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, for those who believe, who are Christians and who believe in the Bible, speaks clearly about man's role in the book of Genesis, man's role in taking care of the earth, which means that the earth is also very precious to our Creator, and He expects us to take good care of the earth, which means that man has a spiritual and a cultural duty to engage climate, to engage the environment in a way that it deems fit to our Creator. So climate change is not just a definition that scientists and all of these people try to coin up, that we look at from an academic perspective or from a political perspective. Climate change is biological, climate change is socio-economical, climate change is cultural, and climate change is spiritual. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And I think honestly, this can help. I think I'll direct the next question to Lyzianah. But before that, actually, Daniel, I really liked how you broke a definition of climate change into the different branches, right? Like you spoke about how there's socio-economic impact, the physical impact, the cultural, but also the spiritual element of climate change. And I think that's really good because personally, I know like when I normally think of climate change in the past, like before I became quite interested in energy and the energy transition, I was just like, okay, climate change, it's just this boring thing, but there's so many aspects to it. And I like how you spoke about a very like tangible aspect, which is the thought of food insecurity and how climate change affects things like food, which, you know, the population of the world, everyone is impacted by access to food. So thanks for making it a bit more tangible and explaining what is climate change and why it matters to Africans, because also food and agriculture is a big industry in the continent. I know someone on the Instagram page of the podcast mentioned like, why don't you talk about agriculture and food security? So I'm glad you even mentioned this. But yes, sorry, Lyzianah, I wanted to ask if you two could shed some light on, you know, like why should Africans in particular care about climate change, and on a more business specific angle, like how can African entrepreneurs and businesses, as well as maybe African women, because I know you're also a gender specialist, but how can they buy into climate change and promote this green transition?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, as we already know, like African countries, we only contribute like 3 to 4%. Like just, I mean, last year I think it has gone up because last year was like 2 to 3%. Now we're like 3 to 4%, to the global greenhouse emissions. But however, we're still bearing the brunt of the climate crisis. Africa, particularly, due to our limited capacity to adapt to the adverse effects of climate change, and over 600 million, Africans, do not have access to clean energy. So they are still, struggling with, energy poverty, and energy is a major driver for businesses in Africa, including SMEs, and also, our African youth population. The African, youth, our demographic, we make up the largest population in the continent, and then our young people also constitute, we're also we're one of the biggest drivers of SMEs in sub-Saharan Africa. So, and then we're talking also including women and, young women, and women as well. And another thing is that, the continent is also highly, relying on rain-fed agriculture. We have extreme weather events, that further even exacerbates food insecurity, and which can potentially lead to even intra-conflicts in communities, like fighting over resources. We're talking about, when there's floods, when there's drought, like our livelihoods, like the animals, there's no grass for them to feed, there's no shelter, so pretty much individuals even are starting to fight over, small resources, further even exacerbating conflicts, or even fighting over land. So that's why, this conversation is so crucial and critical to Africa. And, we've also seen, the economic impact, that climate change has had on the informal labor market. I mean, we know, like in Africa, when we have heavy rainfalls, street vendors, those in the informal sector, we know how it sweeps off their little stand thing if they're like grilling corn on the street, or if they're frying fish or doing something, that's already all gone. So that's why it has a huge effect on Africa. And even when we're talking about entrepreneurs, and them being able to contribute to green transition, I don't know if that's something that you want me to go into as well. But there's so many, like, actually entrepreneurs in Africa, there's so much ways, for them to be able to contribute, efficient ways for them to contribute to transitioning, from them being even engaging in the green economy, to leveraging opportunities like, recycling, creating green skills, like alternative affordable green skills, comprising, our biodegradable products, to reduce environmental harms. So for example, let's say, if we had alternative methods which are very affordable, like for example, like let's say a food seller, or how do you call this? Like, how do you call this? Like like an events planner, for example. Let's say in terms of they can also have affordable methods, like instead of for their cutlery, they can use bamboos and corn, instead of actually having the plastic option. When we're talking about our vendors, like vendors on the street that sell food works, for example, they can use there's reusable rubber, instead of, the regular one as ways, to even, to transition to green options. And also, lastly, I think SMEs, and in terms of there are also other efficient ways for them to contribute. It's even through providing capacity building to other entrepreneurs or any other individual stakeholders that want to get involved on how to build effective green skills in areas, and how to provide alternative methods, as overall, from the different alternative methods that I mentioned earlier. So I would say that those are effective ways for entrepreneurs to get involved. And that's also how, and I think I also, talked about how, why Africa matters, and why Africa is part of the conversation, and how, we're heavily impacted. Yeah.
Thank you for that explanation. I wanted to also touch on, I'm glad you even touched on it briefly, the access to financing. But I remember researching for COP28 last year, I went with the African Union Special Youth Envoy. So that's actually how I know Daniel. Like, we know from me working at the AU before. And I think that's what really cemented my interest in energy and climate change, the environment, and how it pertains and relates to Africa. But when I was doing research ahead of COP28, I was reading about how African heads of states had gathered in Nairobi to talk on the African Climate Summit, where they spoke about proposing a new financing mechanism to help restructuring, like, for Africa's debt and improve our ability to climate funding. And I know, again, in Baku this year, negotiators arrived where we asked, or developing countries asked developed countries to provide at least $1 trillion per year to the continent of Africa by 2035. So this should help finance the global South's, ability to really push the transition to cleaner energy on the continent. However, I know leaders were unhappy with the amount, and it was actually quoted as a betrayal of the world's vulnerability. And so, I kind of understand that financing is very important for getting Africa to transition to cleaner energy sources, right? I think when we talk about the energy transition, I'll briefly even explain that. But we're saying it's a shift away from the typical non-renewable energy sources like oil, natural gas, coal. And a country like Nigeria, I don't even need to say too much, but we are heavily reliant on oil as an export. So shifting from non-renewable energy sources to renewable ones, which tend to be more costly, it's how can we finance this? You say Africa shouldn't rely on non-renewable energy sources. Okay, but we still need to develop and create, like, our infrastructure and stuff. But if you don't want us to do that, we also need adequate help financing this transition to cleaner, more expensive energy sources. So, long story short, I was wondering if you could also add your perspective and explain, like, why is financing and access to finance such a huge role in helping us make our commitment to the energy transition, like Africa as a continent? And I think it'd be great if you could touch on this, because I know you discussed how financial commitments by the global north still remain insufficient to meet the scale of our climate crisis. You touched on this at COP29. So if you could, like, share your insight on this here.
Okay. COP it was a lot. It was so crazy. It was a lot of disappointment, actually. But and then you talked about, the NCQG, which negotiations, at the end of that, only, I think it was 300 billion, dollars, USD dollars was agreed, which was actually very disappointing, especially, for developing nations and countries in the global south. And at COP29 was supposed to be a finance COP, but unfortunately the richer countries, failed to deliver it, and then on their financial commitments, and failing to pay up, developing nations. And then even just before I go into the the answering the question, I just want to give a brief background on how, for African states, African countries or African parties to the UNFCCC, they will actually need, I think, about US 2.3 US trillion dollars, by 2030 to be able to achieve their NDCs, that's the national determined contributors, and about 240 million per year, to have an inclusive, just energy transition. So imagine if we're just getting 300 million, billion dollars for that's definitely not enough. And the energy transition in Africa, requires a large scale of investment, into clean energy infrastructure. So what's happening is that, countries will need to look. So I know, we've talked about, okay, so what's next? So our COP29, so we have Article 6, which cover the carbon credit market as alternative. So that was successfully adopted at COP29, and that was for countries, to look into and explore, adaptation processes, to help finance their climate objectives. So, and then this will also this is like another, like an alternative option, which is through the utilization of carbon credit system. And this can be achieved through nature-based solution. For example, if we're getting like carbon equivalent forests, to offset and sell the credit to renewable energy projects. For example, if China says, okay, you know what, we're not ready we're not ready to stop emitting, but buy this carbon credit, from any global south or any developing country, to help them offset that credit. And this will also give, countries, if they're able to receive that money, it will give developing nations or any country in the global south or in Africa, the opportunity, to finance any of their renewable, energy project that they want to do. And then, and a great successful example is in Guyana, for example, which just recently, sold their carbon facilities, their credit system to the UK, and they were able to use that money, to start over a whole renewable energy system, and just to get more like mangroves, to start replanting trees that will produce again more carbon credits. And then we also and then even just to break down what that the Article 6 adoption covered, so we had the 6.2 Article 6.2 was a voluntary option, which means, okay, countries can go with this option, but there's no accountability, there's no standards, there's no established framework, there's no agreed tone. But the 6.4 was actually giving mandatory standards, to parties, to ensuring that, there's proper accountability, there's monitoring system, everything is in check, everyone is following, the regulation. And earlier I also emphasized, about the insufficient financial commitments, from the global north in Baku. And then, for Africa, I believe that, finance is not just about numbers for us. It's about enabling, us to transition, justly, to have a just transition, to a sustainable and equitable future. So it's so important, for us to be able to have access to this finance, for it to be inclusive and accessible, and for it to come in grants, not in loans. So for me, I think that's what I have to say.
Sorry to interrupt the episode. Promo Oge is here. This is just a reminder that this episode has been brought ever so kindly by Red Radio, your home for much more music and lifestyle, powered by UBA, Africa's Global Bank. But now that's enough. Let's get back into the episode. Exactly. I like the idea of we don't need to be repaying more debts. We don't need loans, but rather grants would be effective. And I actually didn't know that COP29 was seen as overall a bit disappointing, but oh no. Okay, Daniel, moving on to you. So I know you've been to previous COPs before. You were at COP27, COP28, and even if you weren't at COP29, I wanted to ask, what did you think was the effectiveness of African youth being at COPs in the past? And linking to that, how does the African Union help to even integrate young people's voices into advocacy for climate change and how it affects Africans?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Oge. I would say reflecting from COP27, COP28. COP27 happened to be my first COP. I went under the delegation of IOM, the International Organization for Migration, the UN agency responsible for migration. And our focus was on climate migration. And it was, I believe it was quite a good starting point. IOM sponsored quite a number of youth delegates to speak about climate mobility, as the term is coined, and which is actually one of the largest, I would say one of the largest areas of focus within the climate change regime, climate migration. And obviously, a lot of the disasters that have gone on over the past years, natural disasters, human-centered disasters, and some other disasters has exacerbated a lot of climate mobility over the past few years. So COP27 was quite successful, in my opinion. COP28, which yourself and myself attended, was I'll call it quite a very inclusive and successful COP. You could see the level of ambition backed with action from the COP presidency. The COP president himself from the UAE government was very, very involved, especially even in African engagement. He himself attended the Africa Climate Summit. He also made time to engage with youth delegates as well. I attended that meeting with the Special Envoy on Youth to the African Union, Ms. Chido Mpemba. And that was actually, I know Egypt had then appointed a COP youth champion, but at COP28, they moved further to institutionalize the role of a COP youth champion or a COP youth envoy. And as an inaugural instituted role, they did quite well in ensuring that youth perspectives were captured, not just because there were two sides of the coin. There was the negotiation table, and then there was the advocacy table. So those who were not, involved per se in the negotiation rooms, but also those who were in side events who contributed to providing relevant insights to those in the negotiation table as well. So COP28 to me was a very successful COP. COP29, in my personal opinion, this is not the position of the African Union, but in my personal opinion, COP29, I did not see a lot of visible youth engagement. I'll give an example. For COP28, we had a 30% increase in youth participation, physical participation at COP28. I don't think the numbers searched for COP29. Lyzianah, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the numbers searched for COP29 as compared to COP28. And I think, yes, some level of advocacy went on. Don't get me wrong, some level of advocacy went on. We still had the global youth statement. 𝐒𝐭𝐚 did their job very well. We had their global youth statement, which was reflected at the high level negotiation room. But to be honest with you, I am really looking forward to COP30 in Brazil. Like, for that one, I know that we would see a lot more action-oriented decision making than just, promises without, tangible effects. So yeah, that's really my observations. Thank you.
No, very nice, very cool. Daniel, I was wondering though, could we still get a bit of my question was now, in your capacity being a member of the African Union and the Office of the Special Youth Envoy, what does that mean for young Africans? So how is the AU or the OIE helping people that maybe are interested in green entrepreneurship, or people that their businesses are affected by climate change? When we say the AU cares, or the AU is involved in climate change and how it affects Africans on a practical level, what does that mean?
No, thank you. I missed that question. Yeah, thank you for bringing it back to my attention. So I would be very practical. So let me start off from when the special envoy was appointed. So when the special envoy, Ms. Chido Mpemba, was appointed in 2021 November, one of her key priority areas was climate change. So when she came into office, her first inaugural activities was to launch a survey, a digital survey, to gain relevant feedback from young people on areas that they think they could effectively contribute to and some of the challenges that they face. And that was followed through with a physical listening tour. So she toured a number of African countries to engage the young people. And one of the key areas, which is actually reflected in our end of year report for 2022, you can find it in the African Union website, OIE end of year report 2022. What climate change was one of the key areas that was reflected. So now, on the listening side of things, she implemented these key activities. One, countries or places she was not able to go, she gathered feedback online. And the countries or places that she was able to go, she got the relevant feedback from these young experts and relevant voices. Now, from listening, you now move into dialogue with the relevant stakeholders before you actually even move into implementation. So what did she do? She engaged with the relevant stakeholders and partners, both internally at the African Union. We actually have a department responsible for blue economy and the environment, agriculture, and climate change. So she had that engagement with the department, the African Union, and also with the relevant partners that support climate change efforts at the African Union. And in after the relevant consultations and dialogue was had, now implementation started to flow. So one of the first projects that the office implemented and the special envoy's leadership was the Africa Youth for Climate Mobility initiative in partnership with IOM and then some relevant stakeholders, where they selected a number of climate mobility ambassadors, trained them, and facilitated their participation. Now, let me actually use this word, facilitated their meaningful participation at COP. So they attended COP 27. What she also did was to liaise with COP Youth Envoy, the first COP Youth Envoy, Miss Omnia Miss Omnia L. I've forgotten the last part of her name, but we call her Omnia, was the first COP Youth Envoy. And they also facilitated a listening and a briefing session for the Africa Youth delegates at COP 27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Then, beyond that as well, she also worked together with the African Development Bank, where they facilitated the project called the Youth Adapt Program, and the Special Envoy also provided insights to support that program as well. And some young people received grants from the African Development Bank to scale up their initiatives. So beyond that too as well, we also implemented a number of public advocacy initiatives, one of them being a Twitter space, engagement with you, Oge, and I know you'll be happy to hear this, which we worked on, which was quite successful. We also launched a podcast series called Africa Rising, which you can find on Spotify and on Apple Music. Then this year, which is the last area of intervention I'll speak about, the Special Envoy also facilitated a climate change training program in Zimbabwe, where they trained, I believe, over 40 young people on climate change. So yeah, she also, I forgot to add, she also launched a tree planting initiative. Last year at the Africa Climate Summit, we planted about 100 fruit trees, one to offset carbon but two, to also advance food security as well. So these are some of the practical interventions. We also have an African pavilion as well that is always stationed at COP, where young people also come on and they host their relevant engagement. So these are some of the practical interventions that we've been able to fulfill in the climate space.
The reason I wanted to make sure we could answer the question is I know people do appreciate being able to hear like the actual concrete, okay, how can this impact me or what can I take away from this? So, and me, I like the African Union. I guess I know I'm biased, but I just wanted to be able to shed light on what the OIE actually does and how it helps people. So thank you. Thank you both so much for coming on the episode. We're going to have to wrap up soon, but before we did finish, Lyzianah, I want to ask you again about your experience at COP29 this year. So I know you do have some knowledge and experience on bridging the intergenerational gap, and you did this at COP talking about climate action in the Mano River Union of Côte d'Ivoire. So I wanted to ask, why did you choose to speak about this at the Ivorian Pavilion? What was this like? And maybe if you can touch as well on other grassroots initiatives that are done in the region, or I know you're a gender specialist, so if you could tie in maybe how you also see climate change disproportionately affecting women and girls. That's a loaded question, so you can take from that what you would like to address. But yes, I thought it'd be great to actually hear what was it like, hosting events at COP29.
Thank you for the question. Well, I'll talk about like how women are disproportionately affected, and I'll go right into what we covered at COP. So like women and girls, we bear the face increasing, when there's when there's climate change, it exacerbates the women's vulnerability and increasing their risk to gender-based violence. We already know how in the continent, particularly marginalized communities and rural communities, women and girls, primary responsible is, fetching water. When there's climate change, exacerbates water scarcity. And when girls have to go fetch water, this means they have to walk longer distances. So you're talking about, women are more vulnerable and exposed to gender-based violence, and especially even if it's like, let's say if it's in a fragile state or in the area where there's conflict zones. Imagine there's soldiers on the road and they're really not safe. And even reduces even like school attainment and schools closing and them even having to, participate in economic activities. And we not only to talk about my colleague Daniel here, he talked about migration. It also exacerbates, this migration, and a lot of women and girls are living in displacement camps. We're very familiar with the displacement camps in East Africa, and we're talking about climate migration, right? Like even girls are not safe in those camps. So again, exacerbating healthcare and limiting their access to healthcare opportunities, educational opportunities as well. I'll come back to the project just because of time. I'll talk about the project that we're currently working on, CCIS in Moyamba district in Sierra Leone, where we're working with 150 women, where we're trying to get them involved in climate decision, in climate resilience, and building their capacity, and how we can receive drought resistant crops, to be able to adapt to climate change, and even preparing them, because you'll be very surprised that young people in Sierra Leone, like climate change. They're dealing with climate change, where climate change is still like a new conversation. When you're talking about climate, people don't know what climate change is about. So, how can we, introduce them, to sustainable gardening projects and ensuring that, they're part of the green labor market. Now going back to COP, I attended COP as, with YO as a recipient for YOTA, which is part of the Youth African Partnership. YOTA is the Youth Opportunity Transformation in Africa. And then we organized the convener I mentioned earlier of the local conference of youth in Sierra Leone. My organization with other youth organizations in MRU's the Mano River Union region, which comprises of Guinea, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, and Liberia. So we, together with other MRU partners and also some of our youth partners on ground, like the Youth Climate Council in Sierra Leone, we co-organized this event in the Cote d'Ivoire pavilion because Sierra Leone did not have as part of the partnership Cote d'Ivoire, and also we did not have a pavilion, which hopefully we'll be having this year. This year was that did not happen, and it was on bridging the intergenerational gap, for climate action in the MRU. So we talked about practices and why is this so important, the intergenerational conversation. So the conversation, it was just, we made emphasis on intergenerational equity, as a pillar, for resilience for young people. Because mind you, young people, as much as, we're part of the climate conversation, but also understanding that we also need to gather best practices and knowledge sharing from the older generation. So I always say, young people, we always say, we want things now, we want it now, but we also need to bring the older generation part of the conversation. It was also another means to also, be able to communicate to the older generation and other policymakers and government officials, because the Minister of Environment for Sierra Leone was present. We had high-level officials from the Ministry of Environment, from the Ministry of Cote d'Ivoire, and also able to communicate that, our voices matter, and, you can make decisions about young people without, having them as part of the decision-making table. Bringing them on the table. We also talked about knowledge sharing and how, we can share best practices. When we're talking about even in terms of green transition, like electrifying hospitals and providing more solar appliances, and how even young people that are smallholder farmers in rural communities, how can they all be part of that conversation? And how can we share best practices to the older generation, to those policymakers, and how we can also learn from them. When we talk about young girls, that are using charcoal and firewood, and which is exacerbating health risks and causing more health risks, right? For cooking, how can we transition more into cooking, renewable methods? And it's like, okay, but we need to be part of that conversation, and we also need to hear from them, and the power of collaboration, intergenerational collaboration. I always say, we as young people, we might not have the resources, we might have the knowledge, but we need to bring the older generation on the table to be able to get the resources, get your knowledge, and to be able to effectively collaborate and work together. So for me, that's what I have to say. I would have talked about local conference of youth, how the effectiveness of collaboration was so powerful, like being able to effectively work with all the key stakeholders to meet our goals. But because of limited time, I'm just going to cut it short here. But yeah. But we had effective collaboration because now we're working on doing more partnerships and doing projects together amongst other youth partners with Liberia, Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, and Sierra Leone, how we're going to be working together next year to be able to address, be part of climate, to address the advocacy of climate change. It was Nana River, it was just those 4 countries, but we're not limited there. We're not limited.
No, thank you so much. That actually sounds so exciting, and I love to hear collaboration across regions. It sounds like it was 𝐒𝐭𝐚 and ECOWAS thing, although I wasn't hearing Nigeria or Ghana. I hear what you're saying as well, that intergenerational dialogue is definitely needed because, right, we are the ones, young people love to go on about how we are the ones that are going to bear the brunt and what the future generation, etc. But like you said, it's important to learn best practice, right, to find out, okay, how could we maybe go about this better, tackling climate change. So thank you very much. Thank you both of you for coming on. I really enjoyed this conversation. I wish maybe we'll have a part 2. Maybe we'll be back next year after COP30. But thank you both for spending your evening with me today. I really appreciate it. And yes, do you have any last words to listeners?
I think you should start off.
For me, my only thing is for our listeners, if there's any government officials listening or any stakeholder, please, we're grateful for the commitment, but we need more action. We need to shift from commitment to action. That's what we need, especially for us in the global south. for least developed countries. We need the action, and then we need the financing, and let it be inclusive, especially for us young people. When the money comes, I was at the opportunity during COP. We were in closed roundtable meetings with different governments. Like when that money comes, we also want to ensure that it comes directly to young people, because we understand the different hurdles, we understand what that looks like, and sometimes the money can come in by the time it gets to the actual young person is this little. So we want to make sure that us young people, we have direct access to the funding and to the financing when it eventually arrives. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Oge, for the opportunity. I don't take it for granted. So thank you for giving me this platform and to share my humble thoughts. I'll just say that we are facing a crisis. So we are facing an actual crisis, but we're also facing an information crisis. We're also facing a comprehension crisis. And a lot of people don't even know how best they can contribute to the climate regime. And there's a simple demonstration that I normally use when I have platforms like this. And it's encapsulated in 2 words or 2 sentences. Find your context and plug in. So as you see, I'm holding here a plug, and as you can see, this plug has two connectors, right? If I'm able to use it here because this is the context that it is made for. If I take it to Canada, I will not be able to use it, even though it can perform its function all right. But the context in Canada does not allow me to use this plug there. So as a young person, maybe this might be your context. Wherever you find yourself in is a context. What you need to do is to ensure that you are able to, 1, get the right information about your context, and then 2, comprehend rightly what needs to be addressed within that context. So it's as simple as this. Find your context, plug in and plug in well. Thank you very much.
Hi guys, that's the end of this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and please make sure to subscribe and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts and YouTube Audio, as well as follow us on our Instagram page, Africa Everywhere Oge. We hope you loved the episode and catch you next time.
This is Red Radio, powered by UBA, Africa's global bank.